Good morning and welcome to the WAVY Digital Desk. I'm your host, Sarah Good. Today we're going to be looking back on the last few days here in the political arena. Familiar face at WAVY, Dr. Benjamin Molesky is going to be with us today, looking back with us and giving his analysis on what we've seen from the attempted assassination to the RNC to the vice presidential candidate. So we're going to talk about a lot. If you can put any questions in the chat, and I will try to get to them if it's not a part of the conversation. You can find out so much more on WAVY.com. So if anything that we're talking about you want to jump to, you want to find out more, please head over to WAVY.com, and I'm sure you're going to see some more reaction analysis as these days go on, as we find out more leading up to the election. But first, I want to bring Ben on, and we're going to talk about, starting with the last few days, see what we can recap and see what we can analyze from what we know so far. Dr. Benjamin Molesky, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Good morning.
It's hard to even find a place to start. I know that we've been talking to you on air for the last few days now. But first, can you just tell us, Saturday afternoon, seeing whether that was on your phone or on TV, what was happening at the rally? Can you just tell us what your first reaction was?
I was shocked. My nephews were over and I was playing with them at that point, and it was actually my father who texted me and, let me know. So it was just, I think for most of America, it was a Saturday, right? It's kind of a dead news cycle. Nothing's really going on the weekends. People are concerned with their lives, and then you get this. And I think that's the tricky part of the situation is, one, it was on a weekend, and two, we didn't have a lot of information. And I think in this day and age, for a lot of Americans, right, we kind of expect that kind of almost instant gratification of information at our fingertips. And it's a crime scene. I mean, that's what ATF came in and said, and information kind of gets dribbled out there in the interim. So for a lot of people, it's shock, it's horror, and it's also just grasping for any nugget of information they could find anywhere.
And what you're saying too about what you were doing on Saturday, I think Donald Trump Jr. even said, he was just playing with his kids. He actually couldn't get in touch with his father for about 90 minutes, I think. So that was pretty much everybody's take on, Saturday. Obviously, no one expected this in the slightest. And then also want to mention before we, go along with political analysis, obviously there's been a lot of it misinformation, but, tragic loss of life for a father, and then also two critically wounded still. So, it's been the misinformation piece, and we can get into that too. I think to your point, everyone wanted a quick reaction, everyone wanted quick information, but the misinformation was rampant almost, since the first, couple tweets went out with different videos and people saying they're eyewitnesses or not. I mean, we've talked about misinformation a lot in the last 2 years here, about different elections, but misinformation regarding an attempted assassination attempt. I mean, in your view, I mean, how does that look to you? Is that just where we've gotten with AI and technology at this point?
Yeah, I mean, it's in the wake of this, we saw so much different information or misinformation kind of fill this. And we saw it from everything from misidentification of shooters. We saw altered images, false claims. We started to see conspiracy theories kind of run out there that the shooting was staged, or that it was the deep state, kind of pulling back security on Trump, allowing for this. Um, and this is the hard part of this day and age, right? For kind of two things. The first is that um, given that we seek information so quickly, and if there isn't any, it creates essentially a gray space. And that's how most kind of cybersecurity experts view this, is that when we have unanswered questions, there's a gray space. And because it's a void there, misinformation is likely to fill that void. And thus, Americans, and the tricky part of this is, even though we have so much information these days, most Americans typically only get the information from one or two sources. So there's very little kind of counter fact checking taking place. And we typically trust those one or two sources we get information from. So when an individual uses something like AI technology, image manipulation, et cetera, and fills that void, it allows misinformation to be really pervasive and effective at swaying the minds of Americans, because there isn't counter information and truthful information in that moment.
excuse me, and a lot of information we're not going to get. And I think that is going to be a problem, for the next couple weeks. Obviously, I think, they're probably moving this investigation at lightning speed as fast as that can be. But there are a lot of questions that still remain. There's a lot of commentary, even from people high up in both political parties about, what's going on, also the polarization. And I know that, we've spoken in the past about, the polarization of the parties that's continued. But even today, right, there seems to be, even after this incident and the attack, the attempted assassination, there seems to be this blame that goes back and forth, which, we don't know the motive yet, but could be potentially how we got here. We just don't know, right? He could have been looking for a million things. But I mean, what do you think of all of that polarization that's now continuing, even in the misinformation, right? People are starting to blame both sides. People are saying, pointing the finger at both parties, saying, you started this.
Right. And this is the unfortunate endgame of polarization, right? It's tribalism, and it's, as opposed to being political opponents, right, where we're just on different sides of the ideological spectrum and we've got differences in opinion. The way our minds are kind of conditioned to think about this is we actually see the other side not so much as an opponent, but as an actual enemy, or as a psychological threat. And because of that can it can jade, or it can at least color our behavior and our thinking. And depending on the individual, that can lead to different responses. For a lot of a lot of individuals, this can be just as much as discounting information. It can be as simple as tuning out information. But as we've seen, for some individuals, this can lead to a heightened sense of response. And although we don't know the motivations of the shooter, it does lead individuals, again, within this information void, to kind of try to read between the lines or fill in that gap of what we believe to be a perceived motivation.
And I guess it's hard to even figure out where to start because this is right on the back of the RNC. And then that is obviously going to have so much different rhetoric than, say, if we were going into a debate or we were going into maybe not as hostile of a season. But the RNC then, in some of the speeches and some of the rhetoric, obviously is trying to rally up. That's the point of the RNC, trying to rally up, trying to get people on the side to back both Donald Trump and his new vice president candidate. So, it's really interesting to go right into this. I mean, what have you seen in the last few days in that transition from obviously this tragic incident to going into a time where really we're seeing some of the, I guess, most vocal, Republican Party members speaking?
Right. I mean, when we think about what a convention is, right, it's the end of the primary, right? This is the chance for the party to come together to officially nominate their candidate, and, the vice presidential candidate as well. And it also serves a very important ideological function. Over the course of the year, just the average voter, if we start at an election cycle, right, like November happens, people cast their vote and they're kind of here, right? But over the course of time, between one election cycle and another, a lot of things happen in people's lives, right? Things happen with the economy, things happen with policy and health, things happen with the Supreme Court, and people are kind of tugged and pulled away from their ideological position. And what a convention actually does is it gives the party a chance to essentially lay out its policies, bring the star politicians forward with some pomp and circumstance, and it helps to remind voters of where they are ideologically, and bring a lot of them back to the fold. So as such, there is pomp and circumstance, and there's a lot of energy, and there's all these rising stars in the political party that come out for this, right? And what the events of this past weekend have done to this is it maybe throws a little bit of a mute on it, right? We saw leading up to the RNC that there's reports that Donald Trump has rewritten his nomination acceptance speech. We've seen this at least in a little bit so far, with moving away from straight attacks on the president and the vice president, to throwing in more calls for unity. We saw reports just yesterday that Donald Trump and RFK have spoken. and spoken about unity. And that's very interesting, given that, both candidates have kind of ignored RFK to this point. And now he's actually kind of being brought into the fold as a way to say, yes, like, doesn't matter if you're Democrat, Republican, Independent, whatever, at least for this short period of time, we don't know how long it's going to last. Calls for at least national unity, tamping down the rhetoric, are coming out.
And you're seeing too, and this would be great on the service security and the Secret Service side for security, but they're gonna go give protections to RFK. It seems so. We'll see. Oh, sorry, for Robert Kennedy, excuse me. So we'll see, how that goes. We'll see how his campaign goes. Obviously, he's not getting the same microphone, on the campaign trail, obviously, as former President Donald Trump and Biden. But the other thing I wanted to ask too, and we're seeing it on screen, big announcement yesterday, JD Vance, he has been in the past, against Trump. And then obviously that has changed drastically. And then now we're seeing a very different side of this. He's also so different than Trump and even characteristics. He's 39, he's from the middle of the country, like very different background. What was your thought? And he only heard just hours before, I want to add. So, we didn't have a lot of time and background on this, but what was your thought in him getting chosen as the vice presidential candidate?
I think it makes a lot of sense. You look at some of the candidates that were kind of thrown about, making it to, if you want to call it the final round before they get the rose on The Bachelor here. But it's you look at someone like a Marco Rubio. I think he has a little bit of baggage, right? That the president doesn't want to bring to the stage, right? You look at Governor Burgum, and his stance on abortion perhaps is a little bit too strong. But I think somebody like a Vance, right, makes sense from the president's standpoint, right? I mean, he's coming from Ohio, which Ohio's now a state which, we used to think of it as this kind of battleground state, but, much as Virginia's been changing over the last several election cycles, Ohio has as well too, where it's becoming much more of a solid Republican hold. In terms of his background, right? He's got this kind of lawyer, businessman perspective. He's young, like you said, he's in his 40s. He has military service, right? His stance on a lot of issues as it relates to things like foreign policy with Israel and Ukraine matches up fairly closely with what the former president has put forward. His stance on things like the economy and tariffs match up fairly closely. So I think he's effectively kind of a lockstep candidate with Trump, and you're not going to have to worry about him going on the campaign trail and saying something that might be misconstrued as taking the president, or the former president, I should say, too far, right, in one direction or the other. So it makes a lot of sense, but I think in this day and age, also, a lot of people kind of be like, well, why'd you take somebody from Ohio, right? Ohio is this Republican stronghold. Why didn't you go for another state or somebody in the South, right, to help secure that? And what we know about vice presidential candidate selection today is it doesn't guarantee pickups of either home states or regions anymore. It doesn't have as much weight as it did, back, 30, even 40 years ago. So it's more so looking at the vice presidential candidates. Will they make a good surrogate for the president, either in policy or on the campaign trail? And I think the selection of JD Vance does match that.
And for Vance, I mean, people are already this morning, in my inbox, getting those political newsletters. People are already talking about his prospects for 2028. So he's just put himself in a position, obviously, depending on the success of the election. And maybe not. Maybe this gives him a platform enough, regardless of the election, that he is at that place in the country, even though he's sort of a newer, obviously, freshman senator.
I think that's what you expect, right? Be it one of the things I always look for at the convention is to see who's going to be giving speeches, right? And we always see those as like the potential political rising stars, right? And we've heard both parties talk about the fact that the candidates need to get younger. They need to be kind of a new generation of Republicans or Democrats, right? And I think Vance is one of those, right? I mean, we've heard even Governor Youngkin kind of be, with his win in Virginia, he kind of skyrocketed up as a rising star and a potential, there was talk, would he be running in 2024? Would he be the VP pick? And I think this is what we're going to be seeing is a lot more of these kind of younger candidates that are the next generation of Republicans and Democrats stepping up to the microphone as the old guard starts to either retire or take kind of just a more backseat role. I mean, we're looking at McConnell retiring, Nancy Pelosi no longer being the Speaker of the House, right? And kind of these heads of the party now effectively being replaced by the younger generation.
And, with that, with the Democratic Party, obviously the new candidate of the moment in the last now 20 years was Obama. He was the new senator. And now we're sort of in the camp where there's been a couple candidates who are all older in age. And obviously, right now, and to get to Biden, where does Biden sit in all of this? Obviously, he's been, asked for comments and he's been giving press conferences and trying to, I guess, unite the country on the president's side. But, we're in a very different boat, I think, after this event. And we can't say yet how it's going to sort of impact the election. But I mean, to you, what do you see either historically or just in current commentary about how, Trump's strength, might really impact against sort of a weaker Biden, especially after this assassination attempt?
I mean, if we go back to 2016, right, so much of the election was focused on Hillary Clinton and her, I think the words that were used were her stamina, right? And there was images of her falling, and there was images of her fatigue on the campaign trail, right? And that was juxtaposition against Trump saying very much, I am, high energy, and we're seeing kind of a repeat of that, right, in this election cycle. And I mean, if you just go to the polling, I mean, just days after the last presidential debate, I think it was the New York Times poll said it was 70+% of Americans thought that Joe Biden was too old, right? And those numbers really haven't moved much, right, in the coming weeks since that. And Trump coming off of a assassination attempt and being day one at the RNC, going to be effectively accepting the nomination and speaking on Thursday, at least as it should be, and then selecting JD Vance, right? I mean, you're creating this very stark contrast with the president. And it's something that, the president is trying to fight, right? He's going out on the campaign trail, in his speech at NATO, he took questions and, one was asked about him taking, doing events after 8 p.m. and he tried to refute that and talking about scheduling. And it's a very hard thing to break. Once an image is set in the mind of the electorate, that's hard to break. And for Joe Biden, there was rumors, right, leading into the debate that, he was too old or fatigued or he wouldn't be up for this. And then you have a performance like that, and all that does is effectively give evidence to that doubt that was in the mind of the electorate. So he's having to push back against a really calcified image now, and that's a very difficult thing to do.
And we'll see, I guess, what's going to go forward. Obviously, this comes just a week or two after the debate performance, after, calls across, really, it seemed the party to potentially have a different candidate, for him to step down and let Kamala, fill his seat. So, I mean, there's been so much discussion already right before all of this happened. And we were almost out of time, but the last thing I sort of wanted to get to, before we jump in and you sort of push to it, is what you think will come out of the RNC. We already know the VP candidate. He's already selected as the Republican presidential candidate for this election. Are we going to see anything else, momentous come out of this week? At this point, the big sort of time that we're going to keep, an eye on is obviously his speech on Thursday. We'll see how unifying it is. I mean, that was sort of the at least what sources said, across social media, was that is what's going to change maybe his unifying tone. I mean, what do you really expect for him to say on Thursday?
I think he's gonna have to, and I expect him to try to do this, is to walk this fine line because Donald Trump very much is he is the type of candidate we expect him to be on the attack, right? We expect him, especially as you're going against an incumbent president, right? You expect to attack the current president on the last 4 years, and I think he's going to have to, and he'll try to walk a very fine line between speaking to unity, bringing people together, but also doing it in the context of saying, I will unify you under better policies, under I can do a better job than, the last 4 years. And, as a country, we can move to get forward together in that context. So I think his speech writers, I think will do him justice here. And I think the former president will bring his energy and his vigor. But the hard part is going to be in the context of the RNC and in the context of all this pomp and circumstance. Will Trump be able to restrain some of that, right? It's a very difficult thing, when you're kind of riled up with the energy of the RNC, that if he stick to message? Will he stick to kind of that tone and stick to that in that messaging of unification? I expect him to, but that could be the biggest surprise, is if he does go off message. But um, leading up to this, the former president, he is on a wave. I mean, from the debate leading, in kind of the wake of that, and in the current president's kind of floundering, leading into Saturday, leading into his vice presidential pick, and now the RNC, he really is on a wave, and we'll expect him to get a bump coming out of the convention too. So I think the former president is going to relish in this, and I should expect him to do fairly well.
And we didn't even get to this, which just says how crazy the week is, that obviously the case in the case in Florida, excuse me, has also been dismissed. So,
Right.
I mean, what a week. And that we can't get into today. But obviously, there's going to be more coming out, as the summer progresses, as, different conversations come out. But I'm sure we'll get your reaction again, after things unfold this week. And then seeing how the investigation unfolds, I think, is also going to be very interesting in the next few weeks and probably months, really leading up to the election.
Right. So I look forward to speaking with you in the future.
Great. I know you're a familiar face on WAVY, and we're really glad to have you. If you haven't already, please go back and look at Raven Payne's, coverage from this past weekend, from coverage this week, just going to the RNC. So there's been a lot of great commentary. Thank you so much for giving it to us and for, being able to sort of explain and analyze what's been happening, because it is hard to break down. So I think this is helpful for both us and viewers at home, and in getting the right information. I think, even in comments during this, there's a lot of misinformation out there. So please, check your sources, make sure to watch the news, keep up, and sort of maybe frame your own understanding of what's happening right now through legitimate sources, I would say. I mean, is there any advice leading out that you'd give your students on this, that you can give us, just in terms of making sure you're following the right sources, making sure you're keeping up with the latest sort of information?
I always tell my students, as much as it may pain you, open up the other side's news once a day, just to see what's being reported there, and read through it. You may not believe it, right? But over time, right, just hearing that discordant information is a very useful thing to do. We tend to get stuck in our echo chambers, and myself included, and it's a very useful thing just to hear the other side. So that's all I can tell you to do.
No, I love that advice. If anyone's out there and wants to sort of find other sources, go online. There's plenty of places to go. Watch a different channel than you usually do. There are so many resources out there right now, so you can definitely use that to your advantage. Well, Ben, thank you so much for joining us this morning. This is not the last time we're going to be talking to you again during this election season. Head over to wavy.com to replay this conversation, to view more sources, and to go back to previous coverage in the last few days. But Ben, thank you so much again for joining us this morning.
My pleasure, as always.